What if the biggest response to Donald Trump's tariffs isn't another tariff? What if Canada's answer is something much more powerful? Build it here, design it here, manufacture it here, and make Canada less dependent on the American supply chain. That is the bigger story behind the growing push for Canadian-made products. And nowhere is that idea more visible than in transportation. Imagine a bus rolling out of a Canadian manufacturing facility. It carries no political speech. It doesn't make a threat. It doesn't announce a trade war. It simply carries passengers. But behind that bus is something much bigger. Canadian engineers, Canadian workers, Canadian factories, Canadian steel, Canadian suppliers, Canadian technology, and a government increasingly determined to strengthen domestic manufacturing as Canada's trade relationship with the United States becomes more uncertain. That is why the idea of a 100% Canadian bus has captured attention. But there is an important reality check. There is no verified evidence that Canada has suddenly produced a bus made literally from 100% Canadian components. Modern vehicles are deeply international. Even products assembled in Canada can contain parts, materials, electronics, and technology from multiple countries. So the real story is not whether every single component carries a maple leaf. The real story is whether Canada can build more of the supply chain itself. And that question has become increasingly important because of Donald Trump's tariff strategy. In July 2025, Trump ordered the U.S. tariff on Canadian goods outside the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement to rise from 25% to 35%. The White House said the increase was intended to address what it described as Canada's failure to do enough to stop illicit drugs crossing the northern border and Canada's retaliation against U.S. measures. The announcement shocked Canadian businesses because it came after months of uncertainty. But Canada's response was not simply to panic. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Canada would remain committed to GUSMA while taking steps to protect Canadian jobs, invest in industrial competitiveness, buy Canadian and diversify export markets. That phrase, buy Canadian, became much more important, because tariffs have a strange ability to change the way businesses think. For years, a Canadian manufacturer could look south and see a massive American industrial economy. Huge factories, massive suppliers, established technology, efficient logistics, and a market of hundreds of millions of consumers. Why reinvent the supply chain? Why build a Canadian component when an American supplier already makes it? Why spend billions developing domestic capacity when cross-border trade works? Under normal circumstances, those questions make perfect economic sense. But tariffs change the calculation. Suddenly, a product that once crossed the border cheaply can become much more expensive. A component that used to be reliable and predictable becomes exposed to political decisions. A supplier that looked safe yesterday may not look safe tomorrow, and businesses begin asking a different question. What if we build it ourselves? That is where the Canadian bus becomes symbolic. A bus isn't just a vehicle. Think about everything inside one. The frame, the body, the glass, the seats, the electrical wiring, the batteries, the motors, the software, the braking systems, the suspension, the tires, the charging equipment. Every one of those components represents an industrial decision. Who makes it? Where is it made? Where does the raw material come from? And how vulnerable is it to another tariff? If Canada can increase domestic production across those categories, it doesn't just create one Canadian bus. It creates an ecosystem. And ecosystems are powerful. A manufacturer needs suppliers. Suppliers need workers. Workers need training. Factories need machinery. Machinery requires investment. Investors need customers. And customers need confidence that the market will still exist years from now. That is why government procurement can become so important. If Canadian cities need buses and governments prioritize Canadian materials and manufacturers, they can help create the demand needed for domestic companies to scale. Once those companies become larger, their costs can fall. Once costs fall, their products become more competitive. Once they become competitive, they can potentially sell beyond Canada. And that is when the strategy becomes much bigger than simply responding to Trump. It becomes an industrial strategy. Canada is already moving in that direction. In May 2026, the federal government announced $1.5 billion in additional support for industries affected by U.S. tariffs. That included a new $1 billion Business Development Bank of Canada program and another $500 million for regional tariff response initiatives. The government also announced measures to prioritize Canadian steel and aluminum in publicly funded projects and support worker retraining. Look carefully at what that means. The response isn't only, America is taxing our products, it is also, let's make our economy stronger. That distinction matters. Because Canada cannot control every decision made in Washington, but Canada can influence what happens inside Canada. It can influence infrastructure, it can influence procurement, it can influence financing, it can influence training, it can influence investment, and it can influence whether Canadian companies have enough demand to expand. That is where the phrase "Buy Canadian" becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a strategy. Imagine a Canadian city needs 500 new buses. Under one model, the city simply buys the cheapest vehicles available anywhere in the world. Under another model, the government says, we want competitive prices. We want high-quality vehicles, but we also want Canadian manufacturing and Canadian supply chains wherever possible. Now the purchasing decision becomes an industrial policy. The city isn't simply buying transportation. It is helping determine which factories survive, which suppliers grow, which workers get hired, which technologies receive investment, and which country captures the economic value. That is exactly why procurement matters so much in a trade conflict, because the battle isn't only about what crosses the border. It is also about what gets built before anything crosses the border, and this is where Trump's tariff strategy could have an unexpected consequence. The more uncertainty Canadian companies face in the American market, the stronger the argument for diversification becomes. Not because Canada can replace the United States overnight. It can't. The American market is too large, the supply chains are too integrated, the geographic relationship is too important. But Canada doesn't have to replace America. It only needs to reduce its vulnerability. Think about a company that sells 90% of its products to one customer. That customer has enormous power. Now imagine that company develops 3 additional customers. The original customer remains important, but the relationship changes. The company can negotiate differently. It has alternatives. The same logic applies to countries. Canada wants to remain deeply connected to the United States, but it also wants more options. That means Europe, Asia, Latin America, the Indo-Pacific, and most importantly, stronger domestic demand. That is why transportation manufacturing matters. Buses can become part of a larger ecosystem involving batteries, charging infrastructure, software, electrical systems, advanced materials, and engineering. And once those capabilities exist, they can be used in other industries. The technology developed for one electric bus can potentially be adapted to another vehicle. The battery expertise can support other forms of transportation. The electronics expertise can support industrial machinery. The software expertise can support smart infrastructure. The supply chain grows. That is how industrial capacity compounds. And Canada has another advantage. It possesses many of the raw materials needed for modern manufacturing. Critical minerals, energy, metals, forestry products, agricultural resources. The challenge is turning those resources into higher value products. It is one thing to export a raw material. It is another to manufacture the finished product. If Canada exports raw materials and imports the finished machine, much of the value creation happens somewhere else. But if Canada can move further up the value chain, more of the economic activity stays at home. More factories, more engineering, more skilled jobs, more intellectual property, more tax revenue, more export opportunities, and more economic resilience. That is the larger argument behind Canadian industrial policy. And it is becoming more urgent because the trade environment is changing rapidly. The 35% tariff announced in 2025 was not applied to every Canadian product. The CUSMA framework remained important, and a large share of Canada-U.S. trade continued to receive preferential treatment, but sector-specific tariffs have created additional pressure. Canadian automobiles, steel, and aluminum have faced separate U.S. measures. Canada's Finance Department noted in 2026 that more than 90% of Canadian-made vehicles and 60% of Canadian-made auto parts were exported to the United States, highlighting just how exposed Canada's automotive sector is to American trade policy. That statistic tells us something important. Canada cannot simply say, we'll ignore America. The numbers don't allow it, but Canada can say, we need to make our economy stronger so that America isn't our only option, and that is a much more realistic strategy. Now consider what happens if Canadian manufacturers succeed. The first bus may be expensive, the first factory may require government assistance, the first supply chain may be inefficient, the first battery system may cost more than an imported alternative. Critics will immediately point to those costs, and some criticism would be justified. Domestic manufacturing is not automatically efficient. A country can protect an industry so heavily that companies stop innovating. Consumers can end up paying higher prices. Government subsidies can become permanent. Businesses can become dependent on protection. So if Canada wants this strategy to succeed, there is a second requirement. Canadian manufacturing eventually has to become competitive. Not merely Canadian, competitive. That means better technology, lower costs, reliable products, skilled workers, efficient factories, strong management, and the ability to sell internationally. A Canadian bus that requires permanent protection is one thing. A Canadian bus that can compete with the world's best manufacturers is something entirely different, and that is the real test. Can Canada use this period of trade disruption to build industries that survive after the trade dispute ends? Because tariffs can disappear, presidents change, trade agreements change, but industrial capacity can last for decades. A factory built today could still be operating 20 years from now. A worker trained today could become a supervisor tomorrow. An engineer hired today could develop technologies that don't exist yet. A supplier that starts with one contract could eventually serve customers around the world. That is why industrial policy is about time. Politicians think in election cycles, businesses think in investment cycles, factories think in decades, and countries think in generations. Canada's challenge is to make sure today's emergency response becomes tomorrow's permanent capability. That brings us back to Donald Trump. Trump's philosophy is straightforward. Use America's enormous market as leverage. If foreign countries want access to American consumers, Washington can demand concessions. Tariffs create pressure. Threats create urgency. Negotiations follow. It is a strategy based on America's economic size. And there is no question that America has enormous leverage. But there is a limitation. Leverage is strongest when the other side has no alternatives. If Canada builds alternatives, the calculation changes. If Canadian manufacturers find new markets, American tariffs hurt less. If Canadian companies develop domestic suppliers, American components become less essential. If Canadian governments purchase domestic products, Canadian factories become more sustainable. If Canadian consumers increasingly choose Canadian products, domestic demand grows. None of these changes happens instantly, but together they can gradually alter the balance. And that may be the biggest unintended consequence of Trump's tariff policy. Instead of making Canada more dependent on America, the pressure may encourage Canada to diversify. Instead of making Canadian businesses more comfortable with the old supply chains, it may push them to rethink them. Instead of assuming the border will always remain frictionless, companies may start building contingency plans, and once those plans become investments, they are difficult to reverse. This is why the story isn't really about one bus. The bus is just the image. The deeper story is about supply chains, and supply chains determine economic power. Consider batteries. If Canada wants to manufacture electric buses, it needs battery technology. That requires minerals, processing, chemistry, manufacturing, electronics, software, charging infrastructure, recycling. A single bus can therefore connect dozens of industries. The same is true of steel, the same is true of aluminum, the same is true of semiconductors. The same is true of electric motors. Industrial capacity is interconnected. Build one part, and you create demand for another. That is why governments around the world are competing to build domestic manufacturing. The United States is doing it. Europe is doing it. China has done it on an enormous scale. And Canada increasingly understands that simply having natural resources isn't enough. The country needs to capture more of the value created from those resources. That is the economic challenge, and that is why the current Canada-U.S. trade conflict could become a turning point. Not because Canada suddenly becomes independent from America, it won't, but because Canadian leaders and businesses may finally be forced to confront a vulnerability that existed for decades. Dependence. Dependence isn't necessarily bad. International trade exists because specialization creates wealth. Countries should trade. Companies should buy from efficient suppliers. Consumers benefit when goods become cheaper, but dependence becomes dangerous when the rules can change suddenly. If a government can impose a tariff overnight, businesses need flexibility. And flexibility requires alternatives. That's what Canada is trying to build. Alternatives. And there is another reason the bus story matters. Public transportation is highly visible. Every passenger sees the vehicle. Every commuter knows where it operates. If a city begins replacing old buses with Canadian-built electric vehicles, people can literally see industrial policy moving through their streets. They see the product, they see the jobs, they see the technology, and they see a direct connection between government spending and domestic manufacturing. That can create political momentum. More Canadian cities order Canadian buses, more manufacturers expand, more suppliers enter the market, more workers receive training, more investors become interested. And suddenly a small domestic industry can become much larger. That is how industrial ecosystems begin, not with one giant factory, but with demand, then suppliers, then investment, then scale, then exports, and eventually competitiveness. But there is another possibility. The strategy could fail. Canadian manufacturing costs could remain too high. Government support could become inefficient. Consumers could reject more expensive domestic products. Companies could decide that importing remains cheaper, and political priorities could change. If that happens, the bus becomes a symbol of good intentions rather than a transformation. So the next few years will be critical. Canada has to answer a difficult question. Can Buy Canadian become more than patriotism? Can it become economic? Can Canadian companies produce products that people choose because they are competitive, not simply because they are Canadian? That is the real challenge. And the answer will determine whether this entire strategy succeeds. Meanwhile, the trade relationship with Washington remains unresolved. Canada continues to negotiate. The United States continues to use tariffs. And both countries continue to face the economic consequences. But there is one thing that has changed. Canada is thinking differently about vulnerability. The old assumption was that the United States would always be Canada's stable economic anchor. The new assumption is more cautious. The United States is still the anchor, but Canada needs additional ropes, additional markets, additional suppliers, additional factories, additional customers, additional technologies. That is diversification. And diversification is power. So when you hear a dramatic headline about Canada building a 100% Canadian bus, don't focus only on whether every component actually came from Canada. Ask a more important question. How much more of that bus can Canada eventually build itself? How many of the components can be Canadian? How many suppliers can be Canadian? How many workers can be Canadian? How much of the technology can be developed in Canada? And how many other industries can benefit from the same investment? Those questions tell us much more about Canada's future, because the goal isn't to build one perfect Canadian bus. The goal is to build the capability to build the next 10,000. That is the difference between a headline and an industrial strategy, and Trump's tariffs have made that strategy more urgent. When Washington raises the cost of Canadian access to the American market, Ottawa has a choice. It can simply retaliate, or it can adapt. It can build, it can diversify, it can invest. And that is exactly why the current moment could become much bigger than a disagreement over tariffs. It could become the beginning of a different Canadian economic model. One that still trades heavily with the United States, but one that also manufactures more at home, one that develops more technology, one that processes more resources domestically, one that sells more products around the world, one that gives Canadian companies more choices. And if that happens, the ultimate response to a tariff won't be another tariff. It will be a factory, a skilled workforce, a new technology, a new export market. Or perhaps something as simple as a bus rolling down a Canadian street, a bus that represents thousands of decisions made by workers, engineers, companies, and governments. A bus that says, we can build here, we can innovate here, we can compete, and we can choose our future. That's the part of the story Washington should pay attention to. Because tariffs can change prices, they can change trade flows, they can change business decisions. But once a country decides to build its own industrial capacity, the consequences can last much longer. And perhaps the biggest question isn't whether Canada can survive Trump's tariffs. Canada probably can. The bigger question is what Canada becomes because of them. Does it become more diversified, more competitive, more innovative, more self-reliant? Or does the old system eventually return once the political pressure fades? Nobody knows yet, but the decisions being made today will shape that answer. The 35% tariff announced by Trump in 2025 was a shock. Canada's response was to defend its interests while emphasizing industrial competitiveness, buying Canadian and export diversification. Now, in 2026, Ottawa is putting real money behind that strategy, including financing and procurement measures designed to strengthen industries affected by tariffs. And that tells us something. Canada isn't simply waiting for the next announcement from Washington. It is trying to prepare for a world where trade pressure may become the new normal. The bus is therefore more than a bus. It is a test of whether Canada can turn political pressure into economic capacity, a test of whether Made in Canada can become globally competitive, and a test of whether the world's most integrated bilateral trading relationship can survive a period of unprecedented uncertainty. The answer won't come from one speech, it won't come from one tariff, and it won't come from one vehicle. It will come from factories, workers, investments, technology, contracts, exports, and thousands of business decisions made over the next several years. So perhaps the most interesting question isn't, did Canada just build a 100% Canadian bus? The more important question is Canada finally building the industrial capacity to make that claim possible one day? Because if the answer is yes, then Trump's tariff strategy may have created an outcome nobody expected, a Canada that still wants to trade with America, but no longer wants to depend on America for everything. And in a trade war, that may be the most powerful response of all.